Hi guys, and welcome back to Christian Nerds Unite. Today we're going to talk about some of my favorite classic sci-fi novels. Welcome back. Like I said, today we're going to talk all about some classic sci-fi novels that I really love. Now, just be upfront, this isn't the end-all and be-all of classic sci-fi novels. There are definitely some other ones out there that are fantastic that I don't have on my list, but these are ones I really enjoy. Before we get to that, I do want to read scripture, like always. I'm only going to read one scripture today. Matthew 13, 34 through 35. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Now, talking about parables, a lot of these classic novels that I'm going to talk about, a large majority of them do have a lot of symbolic meaning behind them. Some of them are definitely just for fun, but several of them really are part of the time they were written. They are allegories or parables, or at least allude to situations that were going on right then in the world. And that's something I really love about these classic novels. They really make you think about some things that were going on then and still are going on today. Now, I've got a pretty long list of books, and all of them are pre-1985. And now that's on purpose. I really wanted these to be classic novels. I'm not looking at newer things, no Ready Player One on the list. We're not looking at books that are based on some TV shows that you might be familiar with. We're also not looking at fantasy books. So this list is not going to have Tolkien on it. We're not going to see any of those high fantasy medieval knight kind of exciting books. I love those too, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus in specifically on science fiction. Now, when we talk about science fiction, there is a word that gets thrown around sometimes in science fiction. They use the term hard science fiction. And that's a question that some people have. What does that actually mean? Usually when we're talking about hard science fiction, we're talking about science fiction where the concept of science and accuracy and logic is actually used in the book. Also, another thing that's often thrown in for hard science fiction is when technology is explained, even if it's not accurate today, but the technology is explained in such a way that you can visualize what it is, how it works. Those are the things that deal with hard science fiction. I really love hard science fiction. Some of these are definitely not hard science fiction. Some of them are just bizarre. And we're going to start out with probably the strangest one, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, if you probably are familiar with this book, you've probably heard the term, the saying, the answer to the ultimate question is 42. Those are things that we associate with this book. The Hitchhiker's Guide, as described in the book, it's with large friendly type that says "Don't panic," but it is honestly, it's a great little series. It is fun. There is no hard science fiction here at all. Although they do try to explain some things, but they explain them in the most bizarre ways they possibly can. Now, if you didn't know, this was actually a series that started based on a radio play. It was not a book first. And that's pretty unusual for everything else on this list. It is often said that it is a trilogy in 5 parts, although now there are 6 books. Don't ask. Well, I'll go into it actually. But there are 6 books. We've got The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, obviously the first one, and personally, by far the best in my opinion. The next, we have The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which is also really good. Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is the 3rd book, and you should just stop there. Just stop. Don't read the rest of them. They didn't need to happen. Now, this is definitely my personal opinion, and I could be persuaded otherwise, but I doubt it. The first 3 books really feel like a complete story. They have a complete story arc. It makes sense. Then we pick up after that. We have So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, Mostly Harmless, and then a book called And Another Thing. They all try to continue the story, but they continue the story in some strange ways that I don't feel like they fit in as good as the first 3 books did. They're not as cohesive at all. Things get shuffled around more. And if you look into it, you'll find that some of these books were actually originally going to be written as a different character even, and he decided it made more sense in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy universe, so he switched it back. There's some weird things going on there. So I recommend reading the first 3 and just stopping at that point. Another thing to point out is that last book, the 6th book, it's called And Another Thing. It's not actually written by Douglas Adams. It is the same characters. It is an attempt to finish the 2nd trilogy, and it is endorsed by the widow of Douglas Adams, but it wasn't actually written by him. It does have the feeling of a Douglas Adams novel, but I don't think it's as good as the rest. One of the other famous quotes from this book you might have heard is, a common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools. And that is a great example of what this book is all about. It is bizarre things, unlikely things happening, the earth being destroyed because, we're making a bypass, which is, it also ties into the very beginning of the book where his house is being destroyed to make way for a road. It definitely is an odd little collection of books, definitely worth your read. Number 2, and this is probably the newest book on I think this is actually the newest book on the list, and it's Ender's Game. And this book gets some hate, and especially since the movie came out. The movie didn't go well, and a lot of people disliked the movie. I think the Ender's Game book is really good. Now, the Ender's universe, it's vast. I'm not even sure the number of books. It may be 10 or 12. It may actually be more. But the Ender's verse is pretty substantial. We've got prequels, we've got sequels, we have parallel books, books that are telling stories that happen as Ender's story is going on, and Ender is the main character. The basic premise is Ender is a young child that has been watched and trained, and it is obvious that he's going to make a great potential military leader. They take him off to a military school and train him and to play these military games. And in the end, these are going to give you spoiler alerts right now. A lot of these books I will spoil for you. So if you don't want them spoiled, then don't read this. But I feel comfortable spoiling a book that is 35 years old now. In the end, he's playing what he thinks is a large simulation, and in reality, he is commanding a real life military campaign that is being played out as he is giving commands, and they defeat the enemy, completely obliterating their civilization, not just defeating them. And that is a big part of this story. Ender is, has these mental issues that are going on all through the book. And we find out he struggled with all these things of being in control and being protected. And now he's the military leader. He is the guy that is going to take the earth and put them in a position where they can win this war. And once he does, the military leadership is almost appalled. They're happy that it's over, but they are appalled in the way he does it. Now, that is something that carries over into the future books, and that's something that I want to share. Two other books from the series, Speaker for the Dead and Xenocide. Honestly, these are even better books. They're much better. They're much more focused on Ender's struggle to deal with what he has done in his past. Speaker for the Dead kind of tells you in the title that he is speaking for those that he has destroyed. And then the Xenocide is kind of his exile because he destroyed this entire world, and his process that he is going through. It's the guilt, it's the remorse, and it's an attempt at redemption. It is definitely a great series. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the entire Ender's Verse because it's so broad and so diverse, and it gets so strange and weird. Some of the books are really great, but the main three, Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, and Xenocide, make a great trilogy. Next, I have the Foundation trilogy. Now, I say the Foundation trilogy, once again, there are lots of other Foundation books as time went on. But it started out as basically a trilogy. It's a band of psychologists under the leadership of a gentleman who's created a science called psychohistory, a psychohistorian called Harry Seldon. He wants to plant a colony to encourage art, science, and technology so that they can carry on the knowledge of humans after the Galactic Empire falls, which he has predicted. And that is a big part of this story. It's the idea that you can mathematically predict things, but only on a very large scale. He can't predict what you will do tomorrow. He can't predict what a leader will do in a particular situation. But through this idea, this mathematical idea of psychohistory, which gets a little weird, it's psychology, it's history, and it's math, and they're all blended together. But through this science of psychohistory, he can predict very large scale things. He can predict that the Galactic Empire will end in 500 years. Now, he can't tell you how it's going to end, but he can see from everything that's going on that it will. And this gets him in big trouble with the government. And, actually the book starts out with a trial. The novels all have common threads, and they're all weaved in and out of each other, but they have vastly different settings, vastly different characters. We talked earlier about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you read you read all 6 books, basically you have one set of characters that goes all the way through, with a few odds and ends added here and there, and a couple people leaving here and there. But primarily, you follow the path of this one set of people. Foundation is not like that. Foundation is different settings, different characters, different time frames, and in some instances, it's centuries between books. And even in the first book, we actually, between two sections of the book, we actually jump a huge period of time where all the people we were just following are no longer alive because of old age. They've simply passed away, and they've been replaced by a whole new group of people to follow. So it can get a little heavy, and it can get a little dense, and it can be hard to follow. I think it's worth your time. Another interesting thing is, if you read the broader universe from Foundation, you find out that Isaac Asimov actually ties this into his robot series. And that's something we'll mention here in just a little bit. The Foundation series started in 1942, and it is a great series. A lot of people go, how good can a sci-fi book be from 1942? It's amazing how well these old classic sci-fi books still hold up, even almost 80 years later. Another trilogy that I'm going to say is pretty good. It's really weird. And we are a Christian podcast, so I couldn't not mention them. It's the Space Trilogy from C.S. Lewis. If you've not read it, it's worth your time to read. It is a little odd. It's different than any of the other book series on this list. It's not a dense read. It's not a hard read. The novels are actually fairly short. We have this philologist. A philologist is a person who studies the history of languages, and that definitely is right up C.S. Lewis's, right up his alley. But a philologist named Edwin Ransom, he travels to Mars, he travels to Venus, and then we have a third book where he's on Earth. Now, these books were the first book, Out of Silent Planet. It's 1938. So this is a very early book. It's not the earliest book on this list, but it's a very early book for sci-fi. But I would actually qualify this more as space fantasy than true science fiction, because it is definitely not a hard science fiction book. The technology that's talked about doesn't make sense at all. It's obvious that if C.S. Lewis understood anything about what was going on in the field of science and flight and the possibility of going to space, if he had any ideas at all, then he just ignored them and created his own little process. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what this book is, and I want you to know that. So, Out of a Silent Planet, it's set mostly on Mars. And Ransom voyages to Mars, discovers that Earth is actually in exile from the rest of the solar system, that all of the different planets have people living on them, but Earth has been set aside and it's been exiled from the rest. Because far back in Earth's past, it fell to an angelic being. Now, once again, this is C.S. Lewis. This is the Chronicles of Narnia guy. C.S. Lewis is known for his allegory and parable stories. And this is right up there. He is highly tying this into his personal faith and belief. So he discovers that Earth's in exile. It's fallen to an angelic being. And now, to prevent contamination to the rest of the solar system, it's known as the Silent Planet, Earth is. And so the story follows him and people that follow him that are they're the bad guys, and they are disrupting the peace of Mars. We have a very similar story in the second novel. It's called Paralandra, 1943, and it's set mostly on Venus. Once again, Dr. Ransom travels to Venus. It's a strange way to travel. He's traveling in a box that feels like a coffin. And in this one's interesting because the narrator of the book at the very beginning is actually C.S. Lewis himself, saying that I met Dr. Ransom. This is another reason I say these books get a little strange, because in the first book, it was all about Dr. Ransom. In the second book, it's C.S. Lewis meeting this guy named Dr. Ransom and helping him on his way. And he goes to Venus, and this is definitely a Garden of Eden allegory. We've got an Adam and an Eve, and then we have, once again, we have the bad guy showing up and trying to spoil the garden, playing the part of kind of the Satan in the story. Then we have the third book, and it is, once again, completely different. We've got That Hideous Strength. That's the name of the book, 1945. And it's all set on Earth. And we've got a scientific think tank called NICE, NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. It's a secret society. They're in touch with demonic entities. So we've got that spiritual angle again. And all of these books have angelic beings existing in the universe. So that's, once again, we've got that spiritual overlay into all of these books. It's a demonic entity that these people are working with, and they plan to ravage and lay waste to the whole entire planet. It does get a little odd because, once again, we're following Dr. Ransom, but we get into some odd King Arthur references, and the antagonist completely changes. The first two books had the same antagonist, basically. And then the third book, we have a whole different person, a whole different group of people that are the bad guys. We have, Dr. Ransom suddenly now, rather than just being a human that's thrown into this strange world, we have Dr. Ransom, who is large and in charge and has mental powers and can speak with animals, and he has grown tremendously just from book to book, and we don't see, there's not a character growth there. It's just instantaneous when the book starts that he is a changed person. But Dr. Ransom is still the protagonist of the book. Once again, I think these are good books. They are by far not my favorite books on this list. I think the Chronicles of Narnia books are much better from C.S. Lewis, but they are definitely worth a read. And if you like that spiritual angle in your science fiction, you will enjoy these three books. Next, we have I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. It's 1950. And many of you are probably familiar with the idea of the Robot series. These are great books. I have not read all of the Robot series. I have read some of the books where the Robot series mingles with the Foundation series, and that gets kind of interesting. And I like that section of the Foundation series a lot, because it's a lot more linear, where we're not time jumping quite as much in those books. But I, Robot is very specifically, it is not a novel per se. It's a series of related and somewhat interconnected stories. Now, what I have read about how this came about, Asimov had written all of these different robot stories, and his publisher basically came to him and said, we want you to do a novel of Robot, in the Robot series. And, maybe you could take all of your robot stories that you have, figure out how to rework them into one cohesive novel. So rather than just turn them into a full novel that makes sense as a novel, rather than do that, he decided to choose a character, a single person, that he would set up an interview for. And she was a robo-psychologist. Yeah, you got that right. A robo-psychologist, a psychologist for robots. And so she's being interviewed by a journalist, and she begins to tell these stories about the early days of robotics and through to today, and different things that the journalist asks about. So that's where each of these stories comes from. Asimov, as you know, in iRobot, he lays out the 3 laws of robotics, and we see this across the board in tons and tons of different science fiction through the ages. We've got, the 3 basic laws. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first and second law. Now, this is an amazing process that Isaac Asimov set up in these 3 laws. And the premise of the book basically is robots going crazy because of the 3 laws. Either trying to fulfill them as is, the conflict that arises because of the 3 laws is a major theme throughout many of the stories. And then we see others where they have modified the 3 laws. So when we're looking at stories where the laws conflict, we've got a story where we have a supercomputer in 2 major countries that are trying to create interstellar flight, and they find out that, this other country's supercomputer basically went crazy trying to solve the problem. And they're trying to make sure their supercomputer doesn't go crazy as well, because once it went crazy, it was useless. So rather than modifying the 3 laws, they coax the computer into ignoring a few things along the way. And in the end, we find out that it wasn't willing to build the ship initially because it knew building the ship would kill the people that were in the ship. But once it skipped past that ability, once it skipped past the idea that it would kill them, it realized that they would come back to life at the other end. And so it was only temporarily killing them, and it was able to build a ship. It was the only one that could control it, and it sends a couple people into space, and they have a bizarre experience, and the computer still goes pretty crazy. So, fascinating story. Another one of the stories where the 3 laws conflict is, it gets to a story of sending the robot out to do a very specific task, but then once it starts doing the task, it finds that it's in conflict with the 3rd law because it is going to damage itself if it proceeds to complete the task. But if it steps away from the task, then it once again is trying to obey the orders that it's given it, and it gets into an infinite loop. Then some of the stories talk about the results of modifying the 3 laws and how bad that can be. That's where we get the story. If you've seen the movie iRobot, that is the premise of that movie, is this one story in iRobot, the book, where we have an android, a robot that is hiding because the 3 laws were slightly modified, and it causes great strife in finding the robot. By the way, that movie is nothing like the book. So I think the book is great. I love reading this book. I probably read it, once every couple of years, just for the fun of it. Now, I think this is the oldest book on my list. It's 1895, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It's a classic book. There is a great movie from, I think, the 70s that's actually pretty accurate to the book. But a British inventor creates a device that sends him into the future, and he finds there are basically everything that's happened. The world falls to nuclear war, by the way, most of these books, the world has fallen to nuclear war. Just happens. The world is destroyed, and there is a new civilization brought up. And in this world now, there are basically just two races. There's the Morlocks and the Eloi, and the Morlocks are basically grooming the Eloi to kill them and eat them eventually. It's a great adventure story. It's less hard science fiction than it is just an adventure story that has a time travel and science fiction theme. It is a great book, definitely worth the read. Some interesting ideas about time travel in the time machine. One of the big things is it is a time machine only. It does not travel in space. So in order for the time machine to move, you physically have to drag it from place to place because he didn't put wheels on it. They don't talk about the fact he doesn't put wheels on it, but that is kind of a bit in the book that, there's a spot where you can see the path where it has been drug. But there's a big flaw in that is like, well, what if you show up in a time where there's a wall where you are? That could be a problem. And then there's the idea of, in the movie, there's a great scene where he's going into the future and suddenly he realizes he's in the middle of a mountain. That a mountain has grown up where he is. So he can't obviously stop right then. He's got to go further into the future. But it's a great book, definitely worth the read. Now, one of my absolute favorites, and I probably read this once a year, Starship Troopers. Don't go see the movie. It's not worth it. The book is great. Robert Heinlein, 1959. If it's not the most controversial, it's definitely one of the most controversial books Heinlein ever wrote. It's a recruit from the future going through a super tough boot camp. The whole story is military based, and it's his journey in boot camp. He joining the Terran Mobile Infantry fighting against the enemy of mankind. It's set in the far future. The Earth's at war with an alien race. They're referred to as the Bugs. And then we also have another race that's kind of helping the humans called the Skinnies. Now, these are not their technical names, and I don't even know that the book gives them a technical name as far as their race. These are more the grunt military guy term for everything. And that is a big deal in this book. It is the grunt fighting on the ground military guy style book. So if you're into military books, this is a fun book, especially if you like sci-fi on top of that. It definitely is true hard science fiction, in my opinion. A lot of the inner workings are explained of how things function. It's sci-fi militarization. This is where we see some of the first powered armor appear, and that becomes a mainstay of science fiction going forward. So think about that. Powered armor. Somebody thought of powered armor to fight in a war in 1959. That's crazy to me to think that somebody in 1959 was futuristic enough to think that could be a thing. We're still not there, but I think it's possible we could get there. We also see an interesting bit in this book. We see these flashbacks of Rico, our main protagonist, as he's in class in high school, in a moral philosophy class that is trying to explain the culture and society that they live in. They discuss philosophical issues, moral issues, aspects of suffrage, who can vote and who can't vote and why. civic virtue, what makes somebody good. Are people naturally good? They talk about juvenile delinquency, and especially they talk about war and why it has to be a thing or why it shouldn't be a thing. This book definitely leans into militarization and war being a good thing. A lot of people will say this is a novel that is has a fascist bent to it. I don't see it so much as a fascist bent, but it definitely is militarized. It definitely is a warlike book. Be aware if that is something that causes you issues. But I think it's a great read. There's a great story of Rico going to the military and separating from his family, being basically disowned by his father. We have this other story, later on we see them reconcile in an interesting way. We see Rico's journey from, kind of signing up for the military by mistake. Not mistake. That's the wrong word. He signs up for the military because his friend is, and because there's a cute girl there. And but then we see him become a true soldier. We see him become an officer and become the person he feels like he should have been all the time, and finally understanding how the world works. It's a great story. It's a great through line. The next book we have is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Now, most of you are going, what in the world? I have never heard of this book. Okay, if you've heard of Blade Runner, you've heard a little bit about this book. Blade Runner is based on the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And there are a couple of themes in the title that I'll kind of explain as we go along. This book's set in a dystopian future. It was written 1968 by Philip K. Dick. So we've got a lot of this, turmoil. It's dark and gritty, much like the movie was. It is a dark and gritty kind of a crime novel. It's a police procedural kind of thing. There's some things like that going on in the book. We've got detectives and we've got bounty hunters, and all those things that you see in the movie are part of the book, but the story, the through line is a little different. We've got sophisticated off-world androids who turn against their creators, and they secretly slip back to Earth. And the key here is that androids aren't supposed to be on the planet. No androids are allowed on the planet. Androids can only be used off-planet, but they're coming back to Earth. I never feel like there's a good reason for them to come back to Earth, but they do. They have to be hunted down by these bounty hunters. And, Rick Deckard is one of the bounty hunters that is following the trail of these newly arrived sophisticated androids. Sophisticated to the point that you can't tell the difference between a human and an android without doing very special tests. And there's a couple of different tests that are named in the book to determine which is which. Now, there is a lot of different things going on here. We've got, androids not allowed on Earth. We've got people abandoning Earth or migrating off the Earth because the Earth has fallen to a nuclear fallout, and the people that stay, they're not as smart anymore, and they're not able to have children, and so that's why a lot of people are leaving. But it's still a crowded world. There is this idea that people should keep animals. That just, you should have pets. That is a big theme in the movie. And this is why Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? If you can't afford a real animal, you can purchase for a much lower cost an electric animal. It looks the same, it sounds the same, it acts the same, but it's all electronic. You even feed it. You feed it, it poops. To everyone else in the world, as far as they know, your electric sheep is a real sheep. And Deckard has a sheep, and he keeps it up on the roof. That's part of the storyline as well. Something goes wrong with his sheep, and it malfunctions, and he has to take it in to get it repaired. And he's desperate to have a real live animal. All he wants is a real live animal to care for. And that is part of the story, that if you're human, you want to care for something, you should care for animals. If you're an android, you wouldn't care, and you don't care about it. There's a religion of sorts that comes into play. A lot of emotion is tied in with the book. Feelings, caring for people, emoting, joining in with this religious group that watches this guy climb a mountain every day, feeling his pain, feeling others' pain, finding androids that don't feel pain. And that's part of the idea of the test, is that androids can't pass the test because they don't have feelings. Humans can pass the test because they do. Now, if you're a little squeamish, some of the questions that are asked in the Voight-Kampff test are really disturbing. So just be aware if you read this book, there are some scenes that are very disturbing. In the end, it is pretty ambiguous as to whether Deckard is actually a human or an android. That is a big part of this story. Is he or is he not? And he is definitely led to believe that he might be, but it's never clarified in the book. It definitely is a great book. I will say Blade Runner is a great movie, definitely worth watching. The book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is a great book, and you should definitely check both out. There you will see major differences, and I think you'll enjoy the book on its own. Next, we have Dune by Frank Herbert, 1965. This is a book that, there was a movie that came out, I think, in the 70s. It may have been early 80s, called Dune. And then we're about to have another Dune come out, hopefully, if everything works out right, later this year of 2021. So we'll see what that movie looks like. But it's a feudal society. There is, there's the houses that are in charge of different places and different worlds, and they're passed from father to son. We've got kings. It definitely feels like a medieval novel set in the future. And we have a substance called spice. The trade in this substance is super important to the economy. It's a drug that extends life. It enhances mental abilities, and it also is required for space navigation. So it's super important. It's only available on this one planet, and whoever controls that planet controls the spice, and they basically control the galaxy because of it. And this book follows the adventures of Paul Atreides. He's the son of a betrayed duke. And he goes to this planet where the spice is. He's adopted by nomadic people in the desert, and he comes to age and becomes one of their leaders, and becomes kind of a messiah figure for them. And he, is able to finally succeed in the end. Now, there are 5 other sequels in this series. I have not read all the other series. I will say this is a very dense book. This is a thick, long book. It's good. It really is good. But be aware, it's time consuming. It is not an easy read, but it is great. We see a lot of political strife, a form of, like I said, the Messiah kind of situation. And a lot of feudal infighting between families. We have a pseudo religious group with a semi-religious name, this group of only women that have special mental powers, and they play a part into the story as well. We've got the kings that are the leaders. We've got the desert dwelling people that are starting a jihad. It's a political thriller and a war book all at the same time. It's fascinating how they managed to tie this all together. It really is a great book and worth your time. Now, before I give my last book, here are some kind of honorable mentions. Now, I won't say any of the books I mentioned earlier, they're not in any particular order. I really, really enjoy all of them. And I really enjoy the books I'm about to mention, but I think they are a little harder to get into. From a Christian perspective, some of them are a little more questionable. So be aware, and I'll mention some of those things as I go through these honorable mentions pretty quickly. But the last book that I'm going to list it's really probably one of my favorite all-time sci-fi books ever. And we'll get to that as soon as we're done with this list of honorable mentions. Now, I've really enjoyed all of these. Next, it's The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. It's another Ray Bradbury book. Great writer. It's actually a set of 18 science fiction stories that they deal a great deal with death, racism, the end of the world, and it's all told from the perspective of a man showing off his various tattoos, based on the title, The Illustrated Man. And the tattoos seem to kind of come to life as he tells the stories. One interesting story even kind of has a Jesus theme. And this man who is chasing after Jesus from planet to planet as he moves through the universe. So it's an interesting story. It's worth checking out. Just be aware, there are some really, really dark themes in The Illustrated Man. Next is The Animal Farm. George Orwell's Animal Farm. This is a very political novel. And I sometimes even question whether it's science fiction. I think it fits. It's not fantasy. It is more political, psychological science fiction, where farm animals overthrow their human rulers, but they put in their own form of government, which in the end looks very much like the government that they overthrew. So definitely tons of political implications here, and you'll want to be aware. Next is 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is Arthur C. Clarke's seminal work. It deals a lot with death and evolution, the dangers of artificial intelligence, and nuclear war. This is absolutely a classic. It's an interesting read. It's a little unusual because it's one of the few books that was developed along with the movie that its name also includes. The book and the movie were developed together at the same time. So there's some interesting interplay there. And there's lots of symbolism that's not really explained well in the book or in the movie. So it can be a difficult read, a difficult understand, but it's a great book. Next is Brave New World by Huxley. This is a dystopian novel. Now, be aware this one deals a lot with sexual ideas, individualism or lack thereof, drugs that bring contentment, a caste system that's in place, genetic engineering to the point of you know, you're not born from a mother, you're decanted from a jar. And those are some of the subjects that are in this book. It is, once again, it's a heavy book. It deals a lot with the political implications of these ideas, and they bring in an outsider that they call a savage, and you see his perception of their world. It's an interesting book. It is well worth the read, but be aware is some strong sexual content in this book. Next is Fahrenheit 451. This is a great book. It probably should have made my main list, but it just ran out of spaces, honestly. It is a great book. Once again, a dystopian novel where totalitarian regime has ordered all books to be burned by these people called firemen, because now firemen set fires instead of putting them out. It ends with a group who are seeking to preserve knowledge because they are expecting nuclear war to wipe out all of civilization. Their plan is to survive and still have the knowledge of the books so that they can rebuild society. So it's an interesting concept. One of the themes throughout this book is that the Bible is one of the books that's actively being saved. And I think that's a great thing, to throw into our Christian podcast, that it is actually, the Bible is listed as one of the books that is being saved, and it's one of the prominent books included. Next, we have George Orwell's 1984. Now, it's 2021, and the book 1984 is being thrown around a lot nowadays with all the political upheaval that's going on. Once again, this is a totalitarian novel, a dystopian novel. There's a government that watches over all the citizens. Big Brother is watching you. They're changing the meanings of words and removing words from the dictionary. They are rewriting history to match their narrative. Once again, be aware there is some strong sexual content in this book as well, and it is kind of a major theme in the book. So be aware of that outside of those totalitarian government ideas. But it's a fascinating read. It is something to be considered anytime you're thinking, have we changed the meaning of words over time? 1984 definitely addresses those ideas. Next is Stranger in a Strange Land. This is another Robert Heinlein book. I mentioned earlier, his book called Starship Troopers, which I absolutely love. Stranger in a Strange Land is completely different sci-fi. They are not related in any way, but a man that's born on Mars has special powers that the Martians teach him, and he comes to Earth, and he becomes treated almost like a messiah and starts basically his own religion. Be aware, once again, there is a lot of strong sexual content. It's unusual to me that there's so much sci-fi that has so much of this classic sci-fi has strong sexual content. This book definitely has a lot of that. Be aware. Next is A Clockwork Orange. This is Anthony Burgess. Most people are familiar with this book or with this movie. A dystopian novel rampant with drugs, sex, and ruthless violence. It is a brutal book to read, but it is fascinating. Now, let's talk about my final choice. This is, like I said, it's probably my all-time favorite book, and it is The Martian Chronicles. Martian Chronicles, it's Ray Bradbury, 1950. The idea that there were Martians, that kind of idea was rampant in the 50s, that they might exist, that there's something out there. It should be thought of less as a novel and more as a collection of stories. And in this instance, the Martian Chronicles are each individual story kind of builds on the next. Not every single one, but a lot of them are like, early exploration is where we start. And, we have the first expedition and then the second expedition, the third expedition. Then we have colonization later on. So the stories somewhat build on each other or may reference back to one of the others from time to time. Now, depending on the edition, there may be around 20 different stories that are in the Martian Chronicles. Different editions will have a different number of stories. They're all really great. They're all fairly light reading, which is another reason I really like this book. Is it is light science fiction. It's not hard science fiction. It's an easy read. It's enjoyable. It's fun. And there are some dark subjects that go along with it, but it can be an interesting read. The stories explore, like I said, the early expeditions of Mars, what happens to those astronauts, as well as, full Mars colonization, the human race escaping Earth as it falls into nuclear war. Those are the kind of backstory that you're running with in this book. First, know that there are Martians in this book. That is an accepted idea, and that depending on the individual story, their appearance may change and their abilities may change. It's not entirely cohesive, but for the most part, it works. There are many themes. The idea of a hostile world, finding place that they want to live on is inhabited, finding out that it's inhabited after they've arrived, what they do about that now, what colonization does, how does that affect people, the mistrust, the miscommunication, the misunderstanding between cultures. Those are all themes that are covered throughout the Martian Chronicles. So some are from the perspective of the human race, while others are from the Martian perspective. And that is a great way to look at this novel. When you're reading through it, you'll turn the page and all of a sudden we're not looking at the humans that have landed. We're looking at, what are the Martians thinking about what's going on their planet? All these people showing up. There's a Martian man and wife. They have kind of distanced themselves from each other in their marriage. And what happens when a human man shows up? It's a fascinating story. One of the other cool stories that I really like is it's actually usually one of the last, if not the last story. A family they're trying to save enough money to send one person to Mars. That's all they can do. They could build one rocket. They can afford to build one rocket and send one of their family members to Mars. And after much discussion and, much thinking, the father just changes his mind. And rather than building a rocket that will take them to Mars before the Earth is destroyed in nuclear war, he builds a model rocket where each of their family members can join in, get in the rocket, and enjoy a quote unquote trip to Mars. And then at the end, the assumption is that they will succumb to the destruction of the Earth along with everyone else, but they'll do it together and they will have had some enjoyment along the way. This one is my favorite story. It's fascinating, and it comes from a Christian perspective. At least what someone would say, these are questions a Christian might have to consider at some point if extraterrestrial life was real. And, whether you believe it is or isn't, I'm not going to have that debate at this point, but that's the storyline. What does a Christian do when you find out Martians are real? This one is where the Martians definitely appear differently. And there is some conjecture as to why they appear differently, whether they're really Martians or whether they're a Martian projection. What I mean by that is many of the stories have situations where the Martians are able to read the minds of the humans that are arriving before they show up. That's number one. Once they show up, they're able to use those thoughts and ideas that they've picked up from them and be able to project into their minds things that really aren't there. Things as simple as just, a small place, or as complicated as a full town with all of their relatives in them. So this story, the question is, are these Martians that we're seeing, or is this a projection that was picked up from something that one of the members in this story thought of while he was on the way? So it's called the fire balloons, and it also appears in some editions of the Illustrated Man. So be aware, you may see this story two different places. It's a story about an Episcopal missionary expedition, and they are going there to cleanse Mars of sin. And they're discussing on the way what that means. Are they there to, preach to the human race that has started colonizing, or are they there to preach to the Martians and to save the Martians? They're very interested in finding out what kind of sins the Martians could actually commit so that they would know, what kind of salvation they could have. When they arrive, they find out the Martians are not a humanoid form. Now, this is the only story where they're not a humanoid form. And that's why I say the question, are these really Martians, or are these a projection of something that one of the fathers was thinking about on his way? Because as they're traveling, he has this memory of he and his father seeing these fiery balloons being sent off, and they glow in the night sky. So in this particular story, the Martians are depicted as blue, luminous globes of light. In all of the other stories, the Martians are humanoid forms with a bronze-colored skin. So this one's different. They are blue, luminous globes of light. So the priests go and they run into these globes of light, and there's a couple of situations where they have an accident and the globes save them. And they had heard that stories like that before from the townspeople. So the globes saved their lives. So then they basically put the globes to the test, and one of the fathers on purpose falls from a height, and the globes save him. In another instance, he attempts to shoot himself, and the globes save him. He decides to build a church. So in 7 days, he builds a church for them, and it's designed for them. It has imaging that resembles them. He has a Christ-like image, which is more like a blue globe than what we would see as a Christ. After, having kind of a discussion or a meeting with these blue globes, he finds that they are virtuous, and the priests return to the human settlement to cleanse it of sin, because they feel like these blue globes, these Martians, they have no sin, so they don't need the priests. Now, that's a fascinating story. It's fascinating to think about that idea. What happens if extraterrestrials are real? What does that mean for Christians today? How do we evangelize? What does that mean? It's a fascinating mental exercise. But I'm not gonna, like I said, I'm not gonna have the argument as to whether or not extraterrestrials are real or not. But it is a fascinating idea. If you are interested in that idea, you should also check out C.S. Lewis's essay titled Religion and Rockets. It can be found in the book called The World's Last Night and Other Essays. So C.S. Lewis does actually address this idea of aliens and Christianity and what that means. So don't think it's just a Ray Bradbury idea. Well, that's my list. That's my top 10 and a whole bunch of honorable mentions. We have just recently started a Patreon, and you can check that out as well as previous episodes of our show by going to ChristianNerdsUnite.com. Please join our Facebook group and our Facebook page. You can find us at Christian Nerds Unite as well as on Instagram. This has been an absolute blast. I did a survey and I was amazed at the number of people that had read these books and that were excited to hear about them. So I had a lot of fun putting this together, and we will see you next week.